In early March of 2020, in Kotzebue, Alaska, when officers arrive at the former mayor's house, they discover a body whose head was covered with a jacket. The woman had been severely beaten and showed signs of strangulation. Her death would reveal a pattern of generational violence, expose individuals who abused their authority and power, and bring to light a system that failed her and another young mother 2 years earlier on the same property. Who were these victims? And who were the monsters that brutally ended their lives? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. I am your host, Alita Caldwell. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. Kotzebue, also called the Gateway to the Arctic, is a major supply and transportation hub in the Northwest Arctic Bureau in Alaska, lying 26 miles above the Arctic Circle in the Chukchi Seas. It is situated closer to Russia than it is to Anchorage, once known as the polar bear capital of the world and the unfortunate site of trophy hunting. In the 1970s, it was discovered that it held the second largest amount of the mineral zinc in the world. It is home to approximately 3,300 residents, of which 80% are Inupiat, which is a specific group of Alaska natives. Indigenous culture, arts, and community are the heart and center of the city of Kotzebue. It is in this small, very remote seaport town where this story takes place. It is the story of two young Inupiaq women, young mothers, whose lives were stolen by more than just the monsters who killed them. They were destroyed by a cycle of violence that tainted generations of a family, and by a system that continues to fail them and their families today. These women's stories are just a small fraction of the countless cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. They are but two faces of this ongoing crisis of gender and race-based violence. This is the story of Jennifer Kirk and Susanna Susu Norton of Kotzebue, Alaska. Around 6 p.m. on May 23, 2018, the police received a call from a neighbor reporting an unknown disturbance next door. The home was located on the property owned by the Northwest Arctic Borough Mayor, Clement Richards Sr. When the officers entered the residence, they discovered a man in a bedroom lying over a woman who appeared to have been shot. The man was crying and didn't want to leave her side. The victim was identified as 25-year-old Jennifer Kirk. The next day, after her body was found, her case was closed as a suicide. Since her case had been closed as a suicide, this created an additional barrier for reporters to access the police records, which isn't an easy task, even under the most normal of circumstances. The Anchorage Daily News and ProPublica reporter Kyle Hopkins appealed to the police that since her death wasn't an open investigation, they should have access to the death investigation records. The investigative reports were heavily redacted. This means that the reports were altered and modified to exclude the names of the individuals they were interviewing and other specific information. Based on the information that is included, it is logical to believe the police were talking to specific individuals, in particular, Jennifer Kirk's boyfriend, Anthony Richards, and his parents, the mayor, Clement Richards Sr., and his wife, Annette Richards. According to the official death investigation reports, which are accessible to read online, thanks to the diligence and integrity of reporter Kyle Hopkins, the following sequence of events occurred on May 23, 2018, and the days after Jennifer Kirk was found deceased. As previously mentioned, a concerned neighbor had called the Kotzebue police station about their next-door neighbor who had run over to their home in a panic and asked them to call 911. At the time of the event, the neighbor wasn't aware of what had happened, so they simply told the police that there was an unknown disturbance. The mayor, Clement Richards Sr., had 2 different homes located on a plot of land. The houses were located within 440 feet of the police department lobby and even closer to City Hall. There were a dozen surveillance cameras or more that circled the government buildings, and a few were within view of the mayor's house. The police arrived at 6:01 p.m. When they entered the residence, they saw 2 juveniles waiting in the living room. They told the officers that their dad was the one who needed them and that they were in the bedroom. The officers could hear someone crying, and they followed the sounds to a room in the northeast corner of the house. They immediately noticed there was blood at the entry and a man was lying over the top of a young woman, holding her. Officers escorted him from the room. He was hysterical, sobbing, and wouldn't speak to the officers. The man's hands, arms, shirt, and pants were covered in blood. He was soon removed from the scene and placed in a patrol car. The woman was found in a semi-fetal position on her right side, lying at the foot of the bed. Her left arm was positioned at an almost 90-degree angle, and she was bleeding profusely from her head. A rifle lay by her feet, partially covering her left foot, with the muzzle pointed near her buttocks. A bullet hole entrance wound was visible beneath her chin. Officers observed and recorded several areas of blood spatter inside the room, including on the dresser, the mattresses, the blankets, and on several plastic totes. The woman was officially pronounced dead at 6:08 p.m. Investigator Millette and Officer Mike Cox processed the crime scene, while the victim's body was transported to the medical examiner's office in Anchorage. According to their reports, Investigator Millette interviewed the man at the crime scene, identified as Anthony Richards, the mayor's youngest son. Anthony and the deceased, Jennifer Kirk, had been in an on-again, off-again relationship since 2011. They were currently living together and had 2 children. He informed the officer that he was watching television with his kids when he heard a loud pop that he initially believed to be a firecracker. Anthony then went to check on Jennifer in the bedroom, where he found her lying on the bed with a rifle. He said he couldn't find his phone at the time, so he rushed over to a neighbor's house and asked them to call 911. He told the police that Jennifer was still breathing when he left her to get help. But then suddenly, Anthony Richards stopped talking to the investigator, and he told him he was unable to continue at the moment, but he would speak with him later. He didn't protest to handing over his bloody clothing to the police. In what is believed to be a police interview with the mayor's wife, Annette Richards, her son Anthony had been staying at their home with Jennifer Kirk and their 2 kids. According to Mrs. Richards, Jennifer Kirk struggled with addiction, and sometimes when she became intoxicated, she accused her son Anthony of harming her, but that it wasn't so easy to believe her. When the officer inquired about whether Anthony had abused Jennifer on the day she died, she stated that the last incident of domestic violence between them had been the previous October. Annette Richards claimed that she last saw Jennifer 2 days before her death on May 21st, and that she had no bruises visible on her. Mrs. Richards had last spoken to her on the day she died. According to her, Jennifer had asked her to have some diapers brought over to the house, and she sounded as if she had been drinking. This was around 2:30 p.m. Jennifer called her again an hour later asking for the diapers. It is believed that the mayor, Clement Richards Sr., brought them to the house around 4 p.m. He later told his wife that Jennifer, along with one of their relatives and a friend, had been drinking. According to Mrs. Richards, Jennifer had been in a relationship with another man while living in Buckland, which was about 90 miles south. She and Anthony had recently gotten back together, and both she and her son seemed happy. Her son even told her they were planning on getting married soon. She told officers that she wasn't aware of Jennifer having any suicidal ideation, but that when she drank heavily, she easily spun out of control. Mrs. Richards described her as being overly emotional when intoxicated, and that when she was, she frequently made accusations of abuse against her son. Based on her description of her son Anthony, he was very easygoing, especially when he was drinking. But once he became involved with Jennifer, things began to change. Mrs. Richards informed the police that less than 2 weeks before Jennifer's death, on May 16th to be exact, Jennifer told her that she had been jumped over the weekend. Mrs. Richards showed the officers texts between the two of them, including photos of her black eye. The other interview in the police reports or investigative death records appears to be with the mayor, Clement Richards Sr. He told the police that his son had shared with him how, over the weekend before her death, they had been arguing and Jennifer spoke about killing herself. The day before she died, they had all gone to camp and had grabbed a .22 caliber rifle in addition to their other guns and went duck hunting for the day. He claimed that he didn't see Jennifer handling any of the guns, but he assumed she was familiar with how to use one since she was from a native village. In a second interview with the victim's boyfriend, Anthony Richards, he explained to the investigator that Jennifer Kirk had lived in Buckland for a while. They were on again and off again, but when he and Jennifer decided they wanted to work harder on their relationship and make it work, she told him she didn't feel wanted anywhere, but that she wanted to live in Kotzebue with him and the kids. Jennifer lived at what I presume was one of her relative or friend's house for a while, but she felt she had overstayed her welcome. So she left to go stay with him at his parents' house. But according to Anthony, they didn't want her staying there either. The weekend before her death, Jennifer Kirk had gone out with a friend. When she returned on Sunday, she was dressed in different clothes. Her hair was muddy, and she said that someone had jumped her near Atuku. Anthony told officers that Jennifer had multiple scratches on her ankles and on her nose. She also had a bruise on her right eye. According to Anthony, Jennifer didn't want to go fishing when she returned because she was afraid she might cross paths with her assailant, although she also claimed she didn't know who the person was who had jumped her. Regarding questions of her mental health, Anthony told officers that Jennifer had tried to kill herself when she lived in Point Hope from November to January of that same year. She had first attempted to shoot herself with her brother's rifle, and then later on by using his shotgun. Someone had stopped her before she could take her own life, and it left a shotgun hole in the wall. He admitted to officers that they had been arguing on the day of her death over her not wanting to turn herself in to the police. Apparently, Jennifer Kirk had a DUI in which 27 of the 30 days had been suspended, which meant that she still needed to serve 3 days in jail. According to Anthony, he had encouraged her to turn herself in now and just stop putting it off. But allegedly, this only increased her feelings of not being wanted by him. Jennifer began to cry, and he told her to go lie down in the bedroom so as not to upset the kids. He explained how Jennifer was really good at hiding and bottling up her emotions, but then all of a sudden they would explode. Anthony told the officers that while Jennifer was in the bedroom for about an hour, he just hung out with their kids, watching cartoons on the couch. After he heard the sound of what turned out to be a rifle, he rushed into the bedroom to check on her, and that's when he found her bloodied body on the bed with the rifle. He was in a panic, in shock, and he couldn't find his phone, so he ran over to the neighbor's house to have them call 911. Anthony Richards first alleged that the rifle had been near the top of her head, but then he told the investigator that it was lying on her side, so he moved it away from her. Anthony said that he didn't observe any marks around her neck, nor had he seen any from the weekend she had been attacked. When the investigator asked him about physically assaulting her on the day she died, he initially said that he hadn't hit her or done any harm to her since the incident last October. Then his story changed. He broke down and confessed to the police that things had gotten physical between them that day after one of his relatives and a friend had left their house after they had drunk a lot of vodka. That is when he and Jennifer began arguing about turning herself into the police station for the DUI. Jennifer wanted to wait until that Friday to turn herself in, but he just told her she should stop procrastinating and stop putting it off. This in turn made her feel rejected by him, and she said she was leaving to stay with her friend Nancy until Friday. When she attempted to call her friend Nancy, he held her back. Jennifer got angry and began slapping him, hitting him across the sides of his head and ears. So he grabbed her by the neck to hold her away from him. She slapped him harder, and he pushed her away using one hand. Jennifer began to come at him again, and he held her away from him, holding her neck again. This time when he shoved her away, she stumbled to the floor, but she got up quickly again and continued to strike him. Anthony Richards told the investigator that he didn't know how much pressure or force he had used when he was holding her neck. After the second time he pushed her, she fell hard to the ground, but he couldn't recall whether she got up off the floor right away or if she had hit her head and lay there unconscious for a while. Not long after this incident, he told her to go to the bedroom. Allegedly, the physical altercation between them occurred in the kitchen. He swore that he didn't think he had caused her any injuries during the fight. He had just wanted to block out the horror of that day, which is why he hadn't admitted to the police about their fighting and assaulting her on the day she died. Anthony Richards swore to the investigator that he did cause the petechia hemorrhaging and bruising around her neck, but that he hadn't shot her. He had handled the gun in the past, but they wouldn't find his fingerprints on the trigger. Anthony Richards also offered to provide the police with his DNA and to assist in their investigation. On June 18th, investigators spoke with a person who knew about the alleged assault that had been made on Jennifer the weekend before her death. This friend told the officer that an individual, believed to be another young woman, was pissed off with Jennifer for messaging some guy, possibly her boyfriend. According to this witness, she was with Jennifer when this other girl, allegedly a minor, went psycho on her, ran after her, and jumped her. However, based on her friend's interview, she also told investigators that Jennifer had already been beaten up pretty badly before the girl assaulted her, including a black eye and an injury to her forehead. She also told the officers that Jennifer had new injuries after this assault. This friend had seen Jennifer on the day she was found deceased. She had come over to her house with a friend or a relative because her boyfriend, Anthony Richards, had been freaking out on her because she had hidden his vodka bottle from him. This friend said that Jennifer appeared to be upset, but she wasn't obviously intoxicated. She also mentioned how she had never known her friend Jennifer to speak about suicide, nor did she have any knowledge that she had attempted to kill herself in the past. According to former Kotzebue Police Chief Ed Ward, who wasn't working for the police department at the time of these incidents, after reviewing the police records, all 10 of the red flags that are used in the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, which helps officers identify domestic violence killings, applied to the case of Jennifer Kirk. The 10 red flags include the victim dying prematurely. The scene appears to be an accident or suicide. One partner had tried to end the relationship before the incident occurred. There was a prior history of domestic violence, whether it was with her current or former partner. The violence included strangulation and/or suffocation. The victim is found dead in the home. The victim's body was found by their current or former intimate partner. The intimate partner is the last person to have seen the victim alive. The partner had control of and thus access to the crime scene. The body was moved at the crime scene and/or there was evidence of it being altered in some capacity. The practicality of Jennifer Kirk being able to shoot herself with a long rifle has been a lingering question for her family. It was noted in the investigative report by investigator Millette how the length of the rifle from the tip of the barrel to the tip of the trigger was 27 1/8 inches long. Jennifer Kirk's arm length was 26 3/18 inches long, leading some to wonder, at only 5'5" tall, was she capable of shooting herself with a long rifle? Robert Shem, a retired firearm expert for the state crime lab, stated in an interview later on that although these kinds of measurements can be useful in determining whether a death is a suicide, it's not enough in Jennifer Kirk's case to declare her death as one. If the police had thoroughly investigated, they would have conducted a test to determine the probability that someone of the same build and size as Jennifer, while using the same kind and length of a rifle, could in fact lean over and place their thumb in position to pull the trigger. Jennifer Kirk's father, Timothy Gavin, doesn't believe his daughter took her own life. According to him, there had never been any signs of Jennifer wanting to harm herself. She had never spoken about or attempted to commit suicide. Her mother, Doris Stalker, spoke to Jennifer only a few hours before the shooting occurred, and nothing seemed to be off with her. They had even made plans to send each other some local native foods from their respective towns. Yet for some reason, the police never interviewed her parents. It was just one more indication that law enforcement was in a rush to declare her cause of death as a suicide and close the case. Her suspicious death never even made it in the news. The Alaska Department of Law, which oversees state prosecutors, never answered questions as to why no charges were ever filed in her case. Not for the brutal violence she endured before her death, much less for her murder. The death investigation records proved that on May 24th, 2018, one day after her body was discovered, the police declared her official cause of death as a suicide. The Kotzebue Police Department closed the case before receiving the final results of her autopsy. The medical examiner contacted investigator Millette on May 25th with his findings. There were signs of strangulation on the corpse with clear marks on her neck. I don't understand how it can be legal to close a case before the medical examiner has finished evaluating a body and declare an official cause of death. When the police received this additional information regarding Jennifer Kirk's injuries, they informed the medical examiner that they had already closed the case. It was documented in the death records that the medical examiner had later contacted the investigator to state that he was fine with declaring her death as a suicide. A little under 2 years later, the police would return to the same mayor's property. Inside an adjacent house lay the body of a young woman. She had been severely beaten and strangled. The victim was identified as 30-year-old Susanna Susu Norton. This time, the police officers didn't close the case. Cover up the case in record time. Instead, they followed protocol and waited for the official autopsy. The days leading up to this woman's death are convoluted because there is conflicting information regarding the timeline. In a 2020 email sent to news outlets, the Kotzebue police estimated that Susanna Susu Norton had died on either March 5th or 6th. However, according to her sister Vera Norton, Susanna was helping her family prepare a caribou on either the 7th or 8th of March. But, according to police records, they were called to the now former mayor's house on March 9th. There they found the body of a woman with her head covered by a jacket. Her body had been severely beaten, and there were signs of strangulation. The medical examiner's report found multiple blunt force injuries to the neck, head, and extremities. The young woman had been badly beaten, but she had died from strangulation. Her injuries were so severe they couldn't be dismissed or covered up. There was no way to conceal it as a suicide or accident when it was obviously murder. Susanna Susu Norton's death would be officially declared a homicide. The Alaska State Troopers soon took over the criminal investigation from the local police. They stated to the press that they planned to travel up to Kotzebue over the summer to look into her murder. However, this never happened. A spokesperson for the department in late October of 2020 said that even though the troopers hadn't made it there yet, they still intended to before the end of the year. The case was transferred to be handled by the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Unit. In 2021, the former mayor, Clement Richards Sr., was visited by reporter Kyle Hopkins, but he refused to comment. Clement Jr., when approached, stated that he was in Anchorage with his father at the time of Susanna Norton's death, and that he didn't know anything about it. He even went so far as to suggest that maybe she killed herself, telling the reporter how it was common here in Alaska. It was learned through Kyle Hopkins' investigation that just like Jennifer Kirk, Susanna Norton had also suffered prolonged extreme abuse and violence at the hands of one of the Richards sons. On November 17, 2018, the Kotzebue Police Department received a domestic violence report. This time, the offender was the mayor's son, Amos, and the victim was his girlfriend, Susanna Susu Norton, who was 6 months pregnant. When officers arrived at the scene, the young woman was in tears, and her right eye was swollen shut. According to the report filed by City Police Sergeant Norman Hughes, Susanna was trying to prevent him from drinking more, so she poured out all of his beer. In reaction, Amos Richards grabbed her by the hair and dragged her around the house. He repeatedly kicked her in the face, the head, her back, and her stomach. She attempted to block his strikes to her head by holding her arms up in front. The young woman's forearms were very swollen. Despite these vicious details of this assault, the sergeant categorized the criminal complaint as a misdemeanor 4th-degree assault, which is the lowest level and the least serious degree of assault. Due to the severity of the beating she suffered, Susanna Susu Norton went into premature labor only 2 weeks later. The baby only weighed 3.1 pounds, but like her mother, she was a survivor. Susanna named her Eden. The baby struggled with multiple health problems, and not just from her being premature. The Office of Children's Services became involved, and she was temporarily placed with a foster family. In late January 2020, Amos Richards faced charges for abuse against Susanna Norton when she was pregnant. Once again, the law was on the family's side, and Magistrate Mickles, who had helped his brother Anthony years prior, allowed Amos Richards to plead guilty to a single count of reckless endangerment. Despite his horrific abuse, Susanna stayed with him. They even planned to travel to Anchorage together to finalize Eden's adoption, but then Amos Richards stopped responding to the texts from the Sundbergs, who were Eden's foster parents, only days before Susanna was killed. In 2022, Alaska's missing and murdered Indigenous people investigator, Ann Sears, began looking into Susanna Norton's case and even met with Eden's foster family. Strangely and suspiciously, after Ann Sears started learning more about Susanna Norton and Amos Richards, she resigned from her position only 5 months in. She had been the first dedicated missing and murdered Indigenous persons investigator and the first Alaska Native woman to be a state trooper. Just like all the rest of the people Kyle Hopkins and Alaska Daily News tried to interview, Ann Sears declined. In June of 2024, Kyle Hopkins again returned to the former mayor and his son's property. This time, when he arrived, a man answered the door at the back house, told the reporter, "We're not interested," and quickly shut the door. The newsroom at Alaska Daily News sent certified letters to the Richards family detailing their findings during the investigation, along with calls, texts, letters, and Facebook messages. No one in the family has ever responded. The Kotzebue police never interviewed Susanna Norton's mother, who lived 3 houses down from the Richards properties where her daughter was killed. They never talked to any of Susanna Norton's relatives or friends. None of the neighbors who lived in the same plot of land were ever interviewed. In 2021, Eden's adoptive mother, Leslie Sundberg, filed a formal complaint against the Kotzebue Police Department, accusing them of dishonesty and untruthfulness. In her complaint written to the Alaska Police Standards Council, she states, and I quote, "One must wonder if there are unethical reasons why a Native Alaskan woman, mother of 3, daughter, niece, sister, aunt, and well-known community member's murder has been swept under the rug." She never received a response. When Alaska Daily News inquired to the council as to why, the council claimed that they don't investigate complaints of such a nature when a criminal investigation is ongoing, as it would interfere with the process. Except there is no investigation happening. They can claim that her homicide is technically an open case, but there have literally been no steps taken toward investigating her murder, much less bringing anyone to justice. According to the Sundbergs, Eden's adoptive parents, Sergeant Hughes informed them that he was unable to collect certain evidence, which resulted in the search warrant being rejected by a judge. Susanna's mother, Mama Sue Norton, was never contacted by the police about her daughter's murder. She learned that Susanna's official cause of death was homicide when she received her daughter's death certificate in the mail The certificate listed her cause of death as asphyxiation due to obstruction of airways and compression of neck. And this is where her case sits. No progress, no answers, no justice. And the Alaska police refused to even consider reopening Jennifer Kirk's case, even though she was clearly a victim of domestic violence and was murdered. What is known about both of these women's tragic deaths is how they were destroyed by the cycle of violence within the Richards family. It is not at all surprising to learn that the Richards sons were violent, controlling men, considering their father was an abuser himself. Most likely, Clement Richards Sr. was a victim of domestic violence himself by his own father or mother or someone else, since the cycle of violence is multi-generational. But this is just speculation. A decade before he was an elected official, Clement Richards Sr. had been charged with and pleaded guilty to domestic abuse against his wife. Born in 1961 in the city of Kotzebue, there isn't much information about Clement Richards Sr.'s background. He lived in the town his entire life and at some point married a woman named Annette. The couple had 2 sons, Amos and Clement Jr. In 1989, Annette was 8 months pregnant with her 3rd son when she fell victim to her husband's rage. He had beaten her before, and she had an earlier restraining order against him. However, when Clement Richards Sr. kicked her in the stomach when she was with child, and she began to bleed profusely, he was arrested for felony domestic violence assault. Anthony was born the day after the assault, and his father was given 6 months in jail after pleading no contest. When Clement Richards Sr. won a seat in the city council in 1999, 10 years after the felony assault conviction, no one brought up his criminal past. When he was elected vice mayor and then mayor of Kotzebue, and later on the mayor of the Northwest Arctic Borough, still, no one mentioned his violent criminal past. Meanwhile, his wife and victim Annette joined the state trooper's office, where she became an assistant to the state prosecutors, one of whom would become the judge who handled domestic violence cases against her sons. From a criminological perspective, the sons' behavior fits perfectly within social learning theory, developed by Albert Bandura. Social learning theory is centered on observational learning and environmental interactions. In other words, people learn by watching others. It posits that we learn behaviors, attitudes, and cognitive processes from others around us. Individuals, but in particular children, observe, model, and imitate others in their lives, especially adults. A child exposed to violence, whether directly towards them or witnessing violence toward others, will then emulate the same behavior. What is key to social learning theory, though, is that social reinforcement is present as a reason for the person to model their actions after another. This can come in the form of something they desire or reward. The Alaska state prosecutors allowed these monsters time and time again to plead guilty to lesser misdemeanor charges that didn't even indicate domestic abuse. This way, they completely avoided serving any prison time. On multiple occasions, state prosecutors allowed these violent abusers to receive little to no punishment for the harm they inflicted. The earliest known case on record for their sons is from 2013. Clement Richards Jr., the eldest son, was charged with domestic violence assault after a woman alleged he punched her in the face. He was given a deal. He pled guilty to harassment charges instead and received a suspended sentence. This effectively erased the conviction from his record. In a 2014 case of felony charges of sexual assault and attempted sexual assault that were brought against Anthony Richards, a grand jury indicted him on the counts. However, the prosecutor, Rachel Arns, made a deal with him. In return for pleading guilty to a single misdemeanor count of indecent exposure, he not only didn't do any time in jail, but he also avoided having to register as a sex offender. This prosecutor is now a state superior court judge. In another incident in which Anthony Richards faced sexual assault charges, the superior court judge on the case, Paul Rootman, described the defendant's parents as fine third parties during his bail hearing. This crime involved a different woman other than Jennifer Kirk or the woman from the previously mentioned case the year before. The judge set the bond at $2,500. This woman whom Anthony had attacked was terrified, and she was appalled because in such a small town of only 2,900 residents at the time, he could easily find her and come after her. The judge justified setting Anthony Richards' bond at such an extremely low amount because he had worked with the defendant's mother and his father was an elected official. Even though under the Alaska Judicial Code of Conduct, a judge, and I quote, shall not allow family, social, political, or other relationships to influence the judge's judicial conduct or judgment. Judge Rootman openly did just that, citing how he worked alongside the defendant's mother, who knows how to handle these kinds of cases. In November 2015, only 1 month after Clement Richards Sr. was elected mayor, Jennifer Kirk was admitted to the local hospital. She had been punched by her boyfriend Anthony Richards 5 times. When Officer Nate LaCour arrived at the residence, the mayor was extremely intoxicated, asking, "How can I help you?" 3 different times before slamming the door in the officer's face. He reported these details in his December 6th affidavit. It comes as no surprise that Officer LaCourse no longer works for the Kotzebue Police Department. Only a few days later, Magistrate Judge Stephen Brady lowered Anthony Richards' bail to $100, and he was freed. The violence inflicted by the Richards sons only escalated over the years. On March 14, 2017, Jennifer Kirk contacted the police after she had been strangled to the point of not being able to see and almost lost consciousness. Based on a 2005 Alaskan law, this incident alone should have been sufficient enough to charge him with non-fatal strangulation. Ironically, Alaska was one of the first states to recognize how the act of strangulation can increase the risk of suicide and is often a precursor to homicide and domestic violence-related killings. Once again, the same state prosecutor, Rachel Arns, allowed Anthony Richards to plead guilty to 1 count of misdemeanor assault. The magistrate at least pointed out the seriousness and danger of his actions, but that wasn't enough to change his behavior, and he never faced any real repercussions for his abuse. All 3 of the mayor's sons were violent abusers with excessive criminal records. There were 31 criminal cases amongst them, including more than 800 pages of charging documents, testimony, sentencing orders, and protective order requests. In 12 of the cases, one of the sons was charged with domestic violence. The victims involved 6 different women, including relatives, current girlfriends, and former girlfriends, including homicide victims Jennifer Kirk and Susanna Norton. 7 of the cases were filed while Clement Richard Sr. held office between 1999 and 2018. The 3 sons combined had 16 counts of domestic violence, including 5 felonies. The other cases were noted to involve driving while intoxicated, indecent exposure, and trespassing. But as previously mentioned, some of these charges, or almost all of them, were much more violent than they were categorized and convicted for. Although the cases varied in specifics, there appeared to be a pattern in the way they unfolded and were handled. First, someone would contact the police, either one of the girlfriends or a concerned neighbor. When an officer arrived at the residence, the victim would have visible injuries, whether it was bruising, marks around her neck, or a bloody nose. The girl would tell the officer how one of the sons had punched her, kicked her, strangled her, maybe all 3. What would instigate the violence ranged from trying to stop one of the sons from drinking, an attempt to leave them, or refusing to have sex. It was noted that in 2 of these cases, the mayor and his wife refused to cooperate with the police. The police would arrest the sons, but the assault would be categorized as a low-level misdemeanor. When the son appeared at their initial court hearing, the local judge or magistrate, who was sometimes a former state prosecutor that had worked with their mother, they would set bail abnormally low. It was even on record by one of the judges that he told one of their victims that the mayor and his wife would ensure that the son stayed out of trouble until the trial. And yet a criminal trial would never come. Instead, the sons were offered hearings to change their pleas. Then the state prosecutor would lessen the felony charges to misdemeanors, ultimately slapping them on the wrist with a promise that they would do better. These actions by sworn public officials are an outrage. They are disgusting, self-serving individuals who are a complete betrayal of the public's faith and trust in the police and the legal system, the little that still exists. Unfortunately, these unethical and neglectful actions are not isolated to these cases, nor to the city of Kotzebue. There is widespread incompetence, corruption, and neglect exhibited by law enforcement in Alaska, fueled by a lack of resources, lack of education and training, and systemic racism. In 2021, an investigative report by Alaska Daily News revealed the absolute failure of their law enforcement agencies, including local and state police officers and Alaska state troopers, to collect DNA from relevant offenders. Under Alaska's state law, as it is in 31 other states, a person who has been arrested for or convicted of any felony, in addition to specific misdemeanor crimes that are committed against a person, such as sexual assault, must have their DNA obtained. 1 in 4 persons arrested and convicted since 1995 for these qualifiable crimes did not have their DNA collected by law enforcement in Alaska. It was discovered that 21,577 offenders' DNA was never taken, And of those individuals, 1,555 are now deceased. Needless to say, how many murderers, rapists, and other violent offenders were never placed in the state and federal DNA databases because of this, and have gotten away with committing crimes due to this lapse in protocol. Even more disturbing is how many of the departments and state troopers weren't even aware that it was a law and therefore a requirement of their job. For the other departments and troopers who failed to collect DNA, it simply wasn't a priority. To fully understand these cases, it is important to discuss the many factors and challenges that exist in Alaska, in particular for the Alaska Natives. Alaska has a unique set of complications, elements, and factors, both environmental and cultural, which add further challenges to the missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis. Alaska is one of the most breathtaking natural landscapes in the world, but in that vastness lies isolation and extreme vulnerability. The land also creates difficulties of a practical nature and connection between law enforcement and Indigenous communities. Being able to reach and therefore aid and assist Indigenous persons in times of trauma and violence has been recorded as being a huge factor in being able to solve these cases. It has been recorded that it can take several days for a law enforcement agent to travel to the scene of a homicide, and it can even take months under certain circumstances. In terms of natural beauty and land, Alaska is one of the most expansive. It covers 586,412 square miles, but it is the least populous state, with 1.26 persons per square mile, with territory that is larger than the combined space of the 3 largest states in the country. Its lands are home to 229 Indigenous tribes. To put this into perspective, as of 2026, there were 575 federally recognized tribes. Alaska is distinct in that the vast majority of their tribes do not have formal reservations. Natives in Alaska were met with the darkness of colonialism hundreds of years after the rest of the nation. Russian explorers were the first to cross into Alaska in 1741. When they came face to face with the Unankhaq people, the Russians treated them in the same hostile and violent ways, enslaving and killing thousands of people. The Russians, in comparison, were a small group of men, but they exhibited extreme force and violence against the Indigenous people. Within 50 years, 80% of the population had died due to warfare, slavery, and disease. The U.S. purchased Alaska in 1867, and by then, only 50,000 Alaskan natives existed. Alaska was essentially ignored, and then its resources exploited by the U.S. government up until the termination-era policies, which were enacted in 1959, and then it officially became a state. Along with wiping out their jurisdictional powers, it wreaked havoc upon their lands and culture. Systemic racism exists everywhere for Indigenous persons in the United States, but research shows that it may even be higher in Alaska. Alaska leads the nation in having the highest overrepresentation of Native Americans and Alaska Natives who are in prison. There is little doubt that many of these convicted offenders are in fact innocent. They are victims of biased investigations and legal inequalities that stem from historical and systemic racism and discrimination. Similar to the vile Jim Crow laws of the American South, Alaska enforced its own segregation policies and laws with its "No Natives Allowed" signs that prevented indigenous people from entering businesses and segregated them from educational institutions. These rules were not often written into formal law, but they were widespread practices among society. Alaska's government is also structured differently from the rest of the nation because it is more centralized. It distributes its services and resources based on the size and needs of a region. This leads to a gross imbalance of policing and legal services that are provided in rural areas, in particular amongst tribal villages. In what is referred to as the Alaska Bush Country, many tribal communities are so far away from roads that they are only accessible by boat or by air. This leaves many Alaska Natives without any protection from law enforcement. Now, in all other states with indigenous tribes, they have their own tribal police and thus their own jurisdiction. However, Alaska is one of 6 mandatory public law 280 states. The law, established in 1953 under the termination era policies, transferred federal jurisdiction to the states, which dissolved the existing shared concurrent jurisdiction with tribal governments. In other words, this gave the state of Alaska full jurisdiction over all crimes, except for some under limited circumstances. The state police were now handed the sole responsibility of policing, arresting, and prosecution, and without any increase in funding, much less any educational or training resources, lawlessness across the lands was born. What is weird and particularly unsettling is that nothing in the Law 280 specifies that criminal jurisdiction was exclusive to the state. There is no language in the law that excludes tribal governments from having jurisdiction, but Alaska has denied them any relevant funding, justifying it by stating the law has stripped them of any power. Research shows that only 1 in 3 communities in Alaska has a law enforcement presence, and almost all of them who do not are Alaska Native. There are 300 state troopers in Alaska who are considered to be the best trained and are the highest paid officers in the state. However, they are posted within only 11 of the 170 small villages. To put the scarcity of law enforcement into context, in northwestern Alaska, 9 villages encompass land that is as large as the state of Ohio. Across this area, there are only 5 troopers that serve it. Most Alaska Native villages are watched over what are known as VSPOs, Village Public Safety Officers. These are men and women who are trained and paid by the state to handle everything from fires to water rescue to acting as backup for law enforcement. However, not only are they commonly unarmed, but there are currently only 40 to 55 VSPO officers. There is such a lack of law enforcement in these villages that some have even resorted to hiring applicants with criminal backgrounds. We are not talking about petty crimes either. In Stebbins, Alaska, a village of 2 different Native communities, all 7 of its officers had pled guilty to charges of domestic violence before becoming officers. The people in these communities have been left with 2 dire choices. One is that they continue to have no presence of law enforcement at all in their communities, making them extremely vulnerable to acts of violence and other kinds of crime, or they can be so-called protected by the same type of men who help to perpetuate this crisis of violence against Alaska Native women and girls. The lack of resources, combined with female victims being a low priority and difficult accessibility, has led to countless delayed investigations and tainted crime scenes. Alaska has the highest rate of domestic abuse in the country, and females are the victim of rape at 3 times the national average. Alaska has the 4th highest number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the country. According to official crime report data from 2020, for 7 years in a row, Alaska ranked number 1 in the nation for murders of women committed by men in single victim, single offender homicides. The rate is 3.4 victims per 100,000, which is roughly 2.5 times the national rate. Of these victims, over 40% were Alaska Native females. This equates to the homicide rate of Indigenous women killed by men being 12.63 per 100,000 residents. That's 10 times the rate of white female victims in Alaska. This violence is not isolated to Indigenous persons living in the bush country or the wilderness of Alaska. In fact, Alaska's largest city, Anchorage, ranks 3rd in the nation for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girl cases across all cities in the country. Contrary to what some may believe, which is frequently and inaccurately portrayed by the media, the vast majority of perpetrators who commit sexual violence against Native women are non-Native men. One study revealed that as high as 95% of Indigenous Native women who were reported victims of violence were attacked by non-Indigenous men. The FBI can be contacted for assistance in cases including abduction, sexual assault, and homicide, but they are either too weighed down by their own cases and or they have little to no connection with the tribe. This often results in dropped charges, failed prosecutions, disproportionate unfair sentencing, and an all-around lack of justice for the victims and their families. For example, 65.2% of cases in 2018, which the federal government elected not to prosecute, were crimes that involved physical and sexual assaults, sexual exploitation, and the failure to register as a sex offender. With no accountability, this encourages some men, in particular non-Indigenous men, to continue to abuse and rape Indigenous women, knowing they are very unlikely to face charges, much less serve time in jail or prison. Indigenous women are seen as invisible. They are unprotected by the law, or at least the system treats them as such, and thus they are perceived as disposable. This only increases their vulnerability to being victims of violence, including sexual assault and murder. Homicide is the 3rd leading cause of death for Indigenous women. According to the National Crime Information Center database, over 5,600 Native American women were recorded as missing, but the Department of Justice only had a record of 116 cases. Due to the failure of collecting accurate data, the true number of missing and murdered Indigenous persons is unknown, and likely grossly underreported. Much progress and important strides have been made in raising awareness of this crisis, especially in recent years. Various laws and policies have advanced data collection, expanded jurisdictional authority, and encouraged collaboration amongst tribal and non-tribal law enforcement agencies. The Violence Against Women Act was recently expanded to give tribes more authority to prosecute non-natives who commit crimes on their lands. However, under this act, the jurisdiction was limited to crimes involving domestic or dating violence, and only if the offender was known to the tribe. In other words, the offender had to have some kind of ties or relationship to the tribe to have jurisdiction. For all other non-native offenders, including men who raped and murdered Native women, the tribal police still have no authority. Further, of the more than 500 federally recognized tribes, only 18 were approved to exercise this jurisdiction. It sounds to me as if this law was expanded to make the lawmakers appear as if they were invested in the problem, but they aren't committed enough to hand over any real authority and thus jurisdiction to the tribes. Mainstream media like Netflix, for example, has brought some attention to the missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis. And yet somehow this ongoing epidemic of violence is not a priority for lawmakers, and it goes largely ignored by the mainstream media, including the majority of true crime podcasters. How can this keep happening? Why is it that year after year, case after case, almost nothing seems to change? I have covered several stories over the last few years on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and at least on the surface, there appears to have been significant progress in the law and in society's recognition and compassion for the crisis. And yet the problem, this epidemic of violence, still exists year after year, and countless Indigenous people go missing, are murdered, and too few of these victims ever receive true justice. The perpetrators are either never found or aren't prosecuted for a wide range of reasons, and those who are convicted seldom receive fair and appropriate criminal punishment. Our nation has never officially and formally addressed and apologized for the acts of violence perpetuated against the Indigenous Native people of this country, including mass genocide, the taking of their children from the reservations, and attempts of forced assimilation. Our history books in schools barely whisper of what they did, and there are elitists amongst all of our institutions who try to bury the truth. Many people in society, especially those of affluence and power, pretend it's not still an issue, a historical stain, an ongoing epidemic of the generational trauma and violence our country created. Many scholars, lawmakers, and advocates have pointed out that until the government addresses how its actions created a snowball effect of promoting and encouraging violence against Indigenous women, nothing will ever change. I have shared this information before, and I will again and again until something real changes. The murder rate for Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit individuals is as high as 10 times the national average. And yet, 95% of their cases have no mainstream media coverage. We must change that. The culture, traditions, and customs of the indigenous people are beautiful, inspirational, and unique, and reflect the strength, pride, and honor each of their tribe holds, despite the lands, lives, and ways of life that were ripped away from them by colonialism, the patriarchy's attempts at assimilation, and the incessant bias and discrimination they still face. Indigenous people remain devoted to preserving their heritage and fighting for justice for their people. It is up to all of us to invest in caring about what happens to them, as we should care about all people, regardless of their class, their race, religion, culture, or gender. By continuing to share these cases and their stories, putting a face to the crimes, maybe one day our society will finally begin to realize that every name deserves to be known and every victim deserves justice. If anyone out there listening has any information regarding the deaths of Jennifer Kirk and Susanna Norton, please contact the Alaska State Troopers Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Investigation Unit at 907-451-5100. If you wish to remain anonymous, you can submit tips through the AK Tips smartphone app or online. I will put this information in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening to this extremely important episode. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, and especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music, Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.